Hello, Jordan here, and welcome to episode 5 of Java Programming. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you how to use if statements so that your program can be different depending on the user input that we got from the last lesson. Now, I'm going to make a new class. I'm going to call this if statements. And in this public class, I'm going to use public static void main string args. Then I'm also going to use I'm going to make a new object scanner. Console input is equal to new scanner system.in. Then I'm going to import that using Control-Shift-O. Now, if statements can either be equal to, more than, less than, more than or equal to, or less than and equal to, or they can be none of those and be not equal to. So we'll have integer, int number 1, and we'll have int number 2. Then we can start off by saying if, then our statement will go inside these circular brackets of our if statement. So if number 1 is not equal to number 2, then we're going to make sure to have these curly braces after the if statement. We want to set these to 0 by default, so it gets rid of the error. We also want to actually set the numbers to whatever the user wants. So we're going to say sysout system.out.println number, please enter number 1. We actually want print and not print line so that we can get the input on the same line, just to make it look nicer. So number 1 is equal to console input dot next int, and then we want to say sysout system.out.print please enter number 2, and then we're going to do the same again and say number 2 is equal to console input dot next int. Okay, so we have inputs from our user. I'm going to do something else just to make life easier, rather than restarting the program over and over again. Right here, after the int number 2, I'm going to say while, then I'm going to have circular brackets here, and inside that I'm going to say true. Then after that I'm going to have a curly brace, and then after this if statement here I'm going to put a curly brace. Now I'm going to format this with Control-Shift-F, and then it'll nicely format all the code for me. Okay, now this while true by here, it will run the code in here indefinitely. It will never stop until you either press the X button or you press the stop button, which will appear down here. Okay, so in this if statement by here, where it says number 1 is not equal to number 2, we want to print out a message saying that number 1 is not equal to number 2. So system.out.println number 1 not equal to number 2. Then here we can say else. Now we're saying else because we've already had an if here, so we want to say else space if. So if it is not if number 1 is not equal to number 2, sorry, if number 1 is equal to number 2 or is more than, less than, etc., then we want to say else if number 1 is equal to number 2. Then we want to say system.out.println number 1 is equal to number 2. Then we want to say else if again number 1 is more than number 2. Number sysout system.out.println number 1 is more than number 2. Then for our final if statement, we want to say else if number 1 is less than number 2. We want to print out system.out.println number 1 is less than number 2. Then there's also a very final statement. If all of this is, if none of these statements up here, none of these if statements are true, then we can say else. Now these statements cover all possibilities. There is one other possibility that could happen, but it will not happen by here. So we want to say else. If this does happen, that means there's an error. It means that then it may not actually be a number at all. So we just want to say there's an error. Now if I start this, it's going to ask me for number 1. So I'm going to say 10. And then I'm going to say number 2 is 11. Now take note, when after I've hit enter on 11, it's going to come to this statement here. Is number 1 is not equal to number 2? Well, number 1 is not equal to number 2, so this will print out this message. But we may not want that. We may want it to hit this block here, but if this is true, this is not going to actually run because it's already run this one. If we enter this now, we'll see that that's true. Number 1 is not equal to number 2, which is running this one. But if we say 10, and then we say number 2 is 9. If we look again, number 1 not equal to number 2. So the way we've actually layered this code here is wrong. These if statements need to be in a certain order so that it has a chance for all of them to be true. So what we want to do is we want to move this if statement down. So if we come to the very bottom here and say else if number 1 is not equal to number 2, then we want to print out system.out.println number 1 is not equal to number 2. Now this very first if statement we want to delete. If you notice now, we have an error on this bit here. It means that we need to get rid of this else by here because we have no if statement before it. If we remove that, it'll then correct itself. If we press play now, if we say please enter number 1 and we say 10 and then number 2 is 10, it will say number 1 is equal to number 2. So it is running this piece of code first, which is right. After that, if we type in 10 and then put number 2 as 11, it's going to go, is number 1 equal to number 2? No. Okay, let's go to the next if statement. Is number 1 more than number 2? Yes, it is. So we're going to print out number 1 is more than number 2. So if I hit enter here now, number 1 is less than number 2. Okay, we have something wrong. Number 1 less than number 2? Number 1 is less, sorry, I got my operators mixed around. Number 1 is not more than number 2. Here's number 1, 10, and number 2 is 11. So it's actually going to skip over this one because it's not true, and then it's going to come to this third if statement. Is number 1 less than number 2? Well, yes it is, so it's going to print out number 1 is less than number 2. And again, if we type in number 1 as 11 and then put number 2 as 10, now it's going to come to the second if statement, skip over this first one, and then it's going to say number 1 is more than number 2. Well, yes it is. So it's going to print out number 1 is more than number 2. Number 1 is more than number 2. Yes. Okay. Now, we have come across another problem. These 3 statements by here cover everything. So this 4th statement here will never run. Never ever ever run. Because if the number is equal to, if number 1 is equal to number 2, then it's not equal to. And if we say if number 1 is more than number 2, that's going to run this one, but the number 1 is not equal to number 2. But because this runs before this one will not run, and the same with this one here. If number 1 is less than number 2 is true, then that also says that number 1 is not equal to number 2, but again this one will not run because this third if statement will run first. So it is important in how you actually lay out your if else statements, because you can have what programmers call dead code that will never ever run. Just to show you what I mean by dead code is after this while true, so we have the semicolon here which matches up with this one here. So after this I'm going to put system.out.println, and I'm going to say hello. And if you look, I have got an error here saying unreachable code. This code will never ever ever run due to the fact that this says while true. So while true, when you have an if statement, it will always ask if it is true. If it is not true, it is wrong. So while true is equal to true. So true is always equal to 2, so it's always going to run in this loop forever and ever and ever and ever until your PC blows up. so this isn't going to run. It's exactly the same as this will not run. Now it's not detected as it's not going to run because it could from the way it's actually written, but it will never run. Neither will this else statement, unless of course rather than get console input.nextInt, we did a string, got a string input and then converted the string to a number, and we inputted a string that cannot be converted to a number, and then our variable would store something called null. Null basically means something that doesn't exist. It's just a placeholder, and you can't compare a number 1 that is null to a number 2 that equals 15. So it's just going to go, this one is not true, this one's also not true, this one's also not true. This one, where it says number 1 is not equal to number 2, if number 1 is null and number 2 stores a number, they are not equal to, so this if statement is being checked. But there is one problem with this. Even though it's not equal to, because this is null, it's going to just skip over this and go straight to this else statement and then error. Okay, thank you for watching. This has been episode 5, if statements. Please like, favorite, comment and subscribe. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for another video. Goodbye.